This project will have us prepare a loan amortization schedule. And on this schedule, we're going to show for each loan payment we make, how much of it goes toward principal and how much of it goes toward interest. Hopefully this may be something you find useful personally for if you ever borrow money. At some point in time, you might want to know how much do I still owe, and preparing a table like this would help you calculate that. We have a couple of formulas. We're going to work through it manually before we try to do it in Excel. Our formula, first off, for how much of our payment is applied to interest is going to be the beginning principal for that period times the annual interest rate. Now, I'm going to first off assume we're making payments just once a year. In our next example, we'll move on to making payments every month. So the amount of my payment that goes toward interest each year is going to be the beginning principal times the annual interest rate. The amount of my payment that goes toward principal is going to be the total amount that we pay minus how much goes toward interest. So if we have a $1,000 payment, $200 goes toward interest, then $800 of that would go toward the principal. When we complete our loan amortization table, at the end of the life of this loan, we should find that my ending principal is 0. Now, if we do some rounding, we may come up with a very small amount left at the end, but it should be minimal. Keep in mind that your ending principal for one period will become your beginning principal for the next period. So if I owe $500 at the end of this year, well, I will owe $500 at the beginning of next year also. Let's go to our first example. Here we're going to borrow $10,000 at 10% interest for 6 years. Our payments will be made just once a year. We're going to start off with annual payments first. At the end of the year, my annual payments are $2,296. Now, if you've already taken BAF 201, you're probably aware of how we would go about calculating those payments. In our case, when we go to do it in Excel, Excel has a function, a PMT function, that will calculate that for us. But right now we're doing everything manually, so I'm just going to tell you that my payment each year is $2,296. When we make our calculations in this example, to keep it simple, I'm just going to take our calculations out to the nearest dollar. So if something comes up with 50 cents or above, we'll round it up. If it comes up with less than 50 cents, we're going to round it down to the nearest dollar. For our first payment, we pay $22.96. We need to know how much of that goes toward interest. The formula for calculating interest says you're going to take your beginning principal times the annual interest rate. My beginning principal is $10,000. My annual interest rate is 10%. 10,000 times 10% says I would have $1,000 in interest for this first period. How much goes toward principal? Well, it's going to be my total payment minus how much went to interest. My total payment was $2,296. $1,000 of that went toward interest. The remainder, the $1,296, then would go toward principal. My ending principal is going to be my beginning principal for that period less how much of a payment I just applied toward principal. So I owe $10,000 to begin with. I just applied $1,296 towards principal. $10,000 minus $1,296 says at the end of this period then I owe $8,704. For next year, when I go to calculate my interest, it's going to be my ending principal, the $8,704, times my interest rate. $8,704 times 10% says I'm going to have $870 in interest coming for year 2. How much of year 2's payment goes to principal? It's going to be the total payment of $22.96 minus the $870 that went to interest, says I would pay $14.26 toward my principal. My ending principal at the end of the second period would be the $8,704, what I owed at the end of last year, in other words, what I owed at the beginning of this year, minus the $14.26 that I just applied towards principal. $8,704 less the $14.26 says my ending principal at the end of the second year then would be the $72.78. For year 3, how much interest do I have? Well, it's the $72.78, my ending principal for the last period, which became my beginning principal for this period, times 10%, says $728 of this payment is going to go toward interest. How much goes toward principal? Well, it's going to be my total payment, the $22.96, less the $728 that we said would go toward interest. My ending principal at the end of year 3 would be my $72.78 less the $15.68 that I just applied to principal. Says that at the end of year 3, I would still owe a balance of $5,710. For year 4, the amount of my payment that goes toward interest would be my $57.10 ending principal at the end of last year, becomes beginning principal for this year, times my interest rate. Says that I would pay $571 in interest. How much goes toward principal? I'm going to take my total payment of $22.96, subtract the $571 that went toward interest, and that says that I would have $1,725 goes toward principal. What is my ending principal balance at the end of year 4? It's going to be my $57.10 ending principal at the end of the prior year, minus the $1,725, how much I applied toward principal of this payment. Says I owe $3,985 at the end of year 4. For year 5, I'm going to take my ending principal from year 4, which became my beginning principal for year 5, multiply it by 10%. Says I'm going to apply $399 toward interest. How much goes to principal? Well, it's going to be my total payment of $22.96 less the portion that went toward interest of $399. Says I'm going to apply $18.97 to principal. My ending principal at the end of the 5th year is going to be the $39.85 ending principal at the end of year 4 minus the amount of my payment that I just applied toward principal. Finally, for my last year, how much interest? It's going to be the $2,088 times 10%. Says I'm going to have $209 of that payment going toward interest. How much goes toward principal? It's going to be my total payment, the $22.96, minus the $209, how much went toward interest. Says that the balance then is going to go toward principal, or $2,087. My ending principal, well, would be the $2,088 ending balance at the end of the prior year, less how much of this payment went toward principal. Says I would, in this case, end up with a balance of 1. I'm ending up with a balance of 1 just because I've rounded everything to their nearest dollar. If I had taken it out to an appropriate number of decimal places, I would have come back with 0. But we're okay with the number 1. Notice over time what's happened. The amount of my payment that went toward interest has gone down dramatically from $1,870 and so forth down to $209. The amount of my payment that went toward principal has gone up, $1,296 on the first period versus $2,087. The reason the amount of my payment that went to interest has gone down and the amount that went to principal has gone up is because each payment I make is slowly reducing the principal on that loan. As the principal goes down, so does my interest. Our last step would be just to total up our items here. $3,777 is my total amount of interest. $9,999 is my total principal. It should be $10,000. We're off by $1 just due to rounding. Let's move on to a second example. And the only difference here is that now instead of making the payments just once a year, we're going to make the payment each month. We're going to borrow $500, 12% interest, and we're going to make the payment each month for a total of 6 months. My monthly payments are $86.27. Now, again, Excel has a function that will allow us to calculate that. For right now, we're doing it manually. We're just going to actually know that that is my payment amount. I am going to take this one down to the nearest penny just because the amounts I am using are much smaller in this example. I'm going to round to the nearest penny. Our calculations are basically the same with one small difference. When we're calculating how much of the payment goes toward interest, it still is going to be my beginning principal times the interest rate, but then we're going to take that and divide by 12 because my interest rate is stated as an annual rate. If we're calculating interest for a month, we would have to take the annual rate and divide it by 12. So my formula for interest will change slightly. It will be the beginning principal times the annual interest rate divided by 12. All of my other formulas will be exactly the same. For January, for the first payment, it's going to be my beginning principal, $500, times 12%, divided by 12 to get it to a monthly number. Says that my interest then is going to be $5. Of my total payment, $86.27, $5 of it is going toward interest. The remainder then, $81.27, is going to be going toward principal. My ending principal will be still calculated the same way we did it before. It's going to be my beginning principal, $500 for the first period, minus the $81.27 that went to principal from this payment. Says that at the end, my principal balance will now be down to $418.73. For my second month, my payment is still $86.27. How much goes to interest? Well, it's going to be the $418.73 times 12% divided by 12. Why am I dividing by 12? Because it's monthly payments. 12% interest rate is an annual rate. We need to get it down to a monthly equivalent. It says that that'll be $4.19 in interest for the second month. The amount which goes toward principal is going to be the total payment less the $4.19. Says that $82.08 of this one will now go toward principal. How much do I owe at the end of the second month? Well, it's the $418.73 that I owed at the end of the first month, minus the $82.08, the amount that I applied toward principal. Says I'll owe $336.65. For the third month, how much of my payment goes toward interest? It will be my ending principal at the end of the previous month, which is my beginning principal for this month, times my 12% divided by 12. $3.37 will be applied toward interest. How much will go toward principal? I'm paying a total of $86.27. Of that, $3.37 goes toward interest. The difference between the two, the $86.27 minus $3.37 says $82.90, then goes toward principal. My ending principal at the end of my third month then is going to be my beginning principal for that month, the ending principal for the prior month, minus the $82.90, how much I applied to principal, says that I will then have an ending principal balance of $253.75. For the fourth month, how much of my payment goes toward interest? $253.75 times 12% divided by 12. Says I'm going to apply $2.54 in interest. How much of my payment goes to principal? I'm paying $86.27. $254 goes to interest. The balance then will go toward my principal, $83.73. What is my ending principal going to be? The ending principal for the prior month, $253.75, minus how much of this month's payment went toward principal. Says my ending principal at the end of this month will be $170.02. For the fifth month, how much of my payment is going to go to interest? That's the $170.02 times 12% divided by 12. It says $1.70 would go toward interest. How much goes toward principal? Well, I'm paying $86.27. $1.70 is going toward interest. The portion then that will go toward my principal would be $84.57. My ending principal is going to be the $170.02 minus my $84.57. Says that at the end of the fifth month, I owe $85.45. For my last month, how much goes toward interest? $85.45 times 12% divided by 12. Says I'm going to apply 85 cents toward interest. How much goes toward principal? It's going to be my total payment, the $86.27, minus the 85 cents that went toward interest. Says I will be applying $85.42 towards my principal. My ending principal, $85.45 from the prior month, less this month's payment that get applied to principal. Says my ending principal then would be 3 cents. Now again, ideally it would come to zero, but because we're rounding everything to the nearest penny, that's going to throw things off just a little bit. At the end, we'd like to calculate and see in total how much payment did we apply toward interest. It would be $17.65. How much payment do we apply toward principal? Well, ideally, it would be $500. In our case, because we've done some rounding, it would be $499.97. Notice at the end of the loan, my ending principal balance is zero or right at zero. There can be a very minimal difference that would be due to rounding. Other than that, it should be coming out right to zero. Notice a few things. The formula for interest is always going to be the beginning principal times the rate. If it is monthly payments, we have to then take the rate and divide it by 12. The amount of the payment that is applied toward principal is always going to be the total payment minus how much went toward interest. And the ending principal at the end of each period will always be the beginning principal for that period minus how much of that payment was applied toward principal. When we finish, my ending principal again should be zero. That covers how to manually prepare a loan amortization table. The nice part of it is when we go to do it in Excel, Excel will do lots of these things for us. It has a function that will calculate our payment. We can do a simple multiplication formula to calculate my interest. You see a simple subtraction formula will calculate how much of the payment goes toward principal. And another simple subtraction formula will calculate my ending principal. If I see students make a mistake on this project, for starters, usually it is in the area of calculating my ending principal. Some students, instead of subtracting how much of this period's payment went toward principal, they will subtract the whole payment. Well, unfortunately, part of my payment goes toward interest, and the part that goes to interest does not make my ending principal go down. The only portion which reduces my principal will be this amount here, after the interest has already been deducted from the payment.